The room went quiet the second she leaned into the microphone, because this wasn't just another exchange or another soundbite. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She didn't grandstand. She simply dropped facts in a way that made everything click at once. What everyone thought they knew about MTG's sudden resignation started to unravel in real time. Piece by piece, as Crockett connected dots most people were never meant to see, you could feel the shift as faces tightened, side glances were exchanged, and the narrative that had been carefully crafted for the public began to collapse. This wasn't about party lines or viral outrage. It was about accountability, timing, and the uncomfortable reasons no one wanted discussed on the record. In just a few moments, Jasmine Crockett reframed the entire story, exposing why this resignation wasn't random, wasn't personal, and definitely wasn't voluntary. And once you hear what she reveals, it's impossible to look at the situation the same way again. What most people saw was a headline and a rushed explanation, but what actually happened unfolded long before the public ever heard the word resignation. Behind closed doors, pressure doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly through meetings that never make the news, calls that aren't recorded, then warnings framed as friendly advice. In this case, the pressure wasn't about optics alone. It was about leverage, timing, and consequences that could no longer be postponed. Jasmine Crockett made it clear that resignations like this rarely come from sudden moral awakenings or spontaneous decisions. They come when options disappear, when allies start distancing themselves, when internal support weakens, and when legal, ethical, or procedural scrutiny tightens. Resignation becomes less of a choice and more of an exit strategy. Crockett pointed to how the tone around MTG shifted weeks before the announcement, how defenses became quieter, how talking points grew thinner, signaling that something underneath was cracking. She laid out how power inside Congress operates in layers, with public loyalty often masking private concern. When leadership senses that one individual is becoming a liability rather than an asset, the calculus changes quickly. Support is no longer unconditional, and protection is no longer guaranteed. Crockett emphasized that pressure doesn't always come in the form of direct threats. It often comes through isolation. Committee roles lose influence, meetings stop happening, calls go unanswered, and suddenly the safety net that once felt permanent begins to vanish. But that kind of pressure is far more effective than confrontation because it forces the individual to confront reality without a public fight. In this environment, resignation is framed as preserving dignity. But the underlying message is clear: stay and risk greater damage, or leave quietly while you still can. She also highlighted how external investigations and internal reviews often move in parallel, even when the public is only aware of one. Ethics complaints, financial questions, or procedural violations don't always explode into headlines immediately, but they create a trail of concern that leadership cannot ignore. Crockett explained that when multiple issues converge at the same time, the margin for survival narrows dramatically. 1. Controversy can be spun, 2. can be deflected, but several unresolved issues create a pattern that becomes impossible to defend. At that point, resignation is no longer about one incident. It's about preventing a cascade that could implicate others or expose deeper institutional failures. Another layer Crockett exposed was the role of timing. Resignations are rarely announced at random moments. They are carefully placed where they can cause the least disruption or attract the least scrutiny. When she broke down the sequence of events, it became clear that this resignation came at a moment when attention was divided, and narratives could be controlled more easily. That's not coincidence, it's strategy. Leadership understands news cycles, understands distraction, and understands how to bury uncomfortable truths under louder stories. Crockett made it clear that choosing when to step down is often the final act of negotiation, allowing the individual to leave without triggering broader investigations or prolonged media attention. She also addressed how public behavior can differ drastically from private reality. Outward confidence, aggressive rhetoric, and defiance often increase when pressure is mounting behind the scenes. It's a signal, not of strength, but of stress. Crockett pointed out that when someone doubles down publicly, it can be an attempt to maintain leverage while they still have it. Once that leverage disappears, the tone changes quickly, statements become shorter, appearances become fewer, and eventually the announcement arrives. This pattern isn't unique, it's repeated over and over in political history. And Crockett connected this resignation to that exact playbook. What made her explanation especially striking was how she reframed resignation not as an escape, but as containment. By stepping down, damage is limited, exposure is reduced, and institutions protect themselves from deeper scrutiny. Crockett emphasized that this isn't about one person's actions alone, it's about the systems that respond when those actions threaten stability. Resignation becomes a pressure valve, releasing tension before it turns into something explosive. That's why these moments often feel abrupt to the public, even though they've been building internally for months. She also spoke about the illusion of voluntariness. Official statements almost always emphasize personal reasons, family considerations, or a desire to focus elsewhere, because admitting pressure would raise uncomfortable questions about what forced the decision. Crockett dismantled that illusion by pointing out how rarely powerful figures leave when they still hold leverage. People don't walk away from influence without a reason, and when they do, it's almost always because the cost of staying has become too high. That cost doesn't have to be visible to be real. By laying out these hidden dynamics, Crockett shifted the conversation away from personality and toward power. She showed that resignations like this are less about individual drama and more about institutional self-preservation. The moment she connected these dots, the story stopped being about a sudden decision and started being about a slow squeeze that finally reached its limit. The pressure, once invisible, suddenly made sense, revealing why the resignation wasn't shocking to those inside the system, only to those watching from the outside. Jasmine Crockett approached the situation differently than most commentators because she didn't rely on speculation or dramatic accusations. She relied on patterns, timelines, and inconsistencies that were already in plain sight. What the media largely treated as isolated events, she treated as connected pieces of a much larger picture. Instead of reacting to the resignation itself, she rewound the story and asked a more uncomfortable question: what changed, and when? Did it change? By laying out the sequence of events, step by step, she exposed gaps between public statements and private actions that had gone largely unquestioned. These weren't hidden documents or secret recordings. They were facts buried under noise, overlooked because they didn't fit neatly into a headline or a partisan narrative. She pointed out how media coverage often focuses on the loudest moments, the viral clips, the confrontations, while ignoring quieter but more revealing shifts. Committee absences, sudden changes in messaging, allies who once spoke loudly going silent, and procedural moves that seemed minor on their own but significant when viewed together. Crockett showed how these signals tend to appear before any major political exit, functioning almost like early warning signs. The media mentioned these details in passing, if at all, but never connected them. By aligning them on a timeline, she revealed a steady unraveling rather than a sudden collapse. Another overlooked element, she emphasized, was the change in institutional tone. Statements from leadership, spokespersons, and party figures subtly evolved over time. Words like fully support quietly turned into monitoring the situation and later into carefully neutral language. To most viewers, these shifts sound insignificant, but Crockett explained that inside political systems, language is calibrated very carefully. Support is rarely withdrawn publicly all at once. It's softened first. That soften is often the first sign that internal confidence is eroding. Media outlets often repeat these statements without analyzing how different they sound from earlier assurances, missing the story hidden in the wording itself. Crockett also drew attention to timing discrepancies that didn't add up. Certain defenses appeared before accusations were widely known, suggesting preemptive positioning rather than reactive clarification. She questioned why explanations were ready so quickly, why narratives were shaped before full details were public. That kind of preparedness usually indicates anticipation, not surprise. The media largely accepted these explanations at face value, but Crockett treated them as clues. If there was nothing to worry about, why the rush to control the story? But asking that question, she reframed what others dismissed as efficiency into something far more revealing. She further highlighted how selective coverage can distort reality. Some outlets focused heavily on personality clashes and controversial statements, framing the resignation as a consequence of public behavior alone. Crockett argued that this framing was convenient because it reduced the situation to optics rather than substance. By doing so, it allowed deeper issues to remain untouched. She pointed out that controversial behavior had existed for a long time without triggering resignation, so the idea that it suddenly became intolerable didn't hold up. Something else had shifted. and that shift wasn't being examined closely enough. Financial disclosures, procedural filings, and ethics-related developments were another area she said had been largely ignored. While none of these elements individually proved wrongdoing, Crockett emphasized that politics rarely operates on single red flags, it operates on accumulation. Small concerns stack on top of each other until the risk becomes unacceptable. The media mentioned these developments separately, often buried in articles or relegated to brief segments, but never explored how they might intersect. Crockett's strength was in showing how accumulation changes the stakes, even when no single issue seems decisive on its own. She also addressed the role of distraction in modern political coverage. News cycles move fast, and when multiple major stories compete for attention, context is often sacrificed. Crockett noted that the resignation occurred during a period when public focus was pulled in several directions, reducing the likelihood of sustained scrutiny. Media outlets reported the event, then quickly moved on. By slowing the story down and revisiting earlier reporting, she exposed how much had been glossed over in the rush to keep up with breaking news. What looked like thorough coverage was actually fragmented storytelling. Another fact she connected was the sudden change in internal discipline and enforcement. Rules that had previously been applied loosely were suddenly enforced, more strictly, at least in this case. Crockett questioned why standards seemed to tighten so abruptly, and why enforcement appeared selective. Media coverage often treats rule enforcement as neutral and procedural, but Crockett argued that enforcement timing often reflects internal pressure rather than pure principle. When institutions feel threatened, they enforce rules more aggressively to protect themselves. That context was missing from most reporting, yet it fundamentally changed the interpretation of events. She also drew attention to who was not speaking. Silence, she argued, can be more revealing than statements. Figures who normally rush to defend were notably absent, declining interviews or offering non-committal responses. Media outlets mentioned these absences but didn't explore their significance. Crockett explained that silence in politics is rarely accidental. When people stop defending someone publicly, it usually means they no longer feel safe doing so. That shift often precedes a fall, and recognizing it requires paying attention to what isn't being said as much as what is. By connecting these overlooked facts, Crockett transforms scattered information into a coherent narrative. She didn't accuse, she contextualized, she didn't speculate, she aligned time lanes. In doing so, she showed how easy it is for critical details to be missed when coverage prioritizes speed over depth and drama over analysis. The resignation, once viewed through this lens, stopped looking sudden or mysterious and started looking like the inevitable outcome of pressures that had been quietly mounting in full view, and just never fully examined together. The turning point came when the story everyone thought they understood could no longer hold together under even minimal scrutiny. Jasmine Crockett zeroed in on the exact moment the official explanation began to contradict itself, not through a dramatic accusation, but through simple logic. She pointed out how early statements framed the resignation as orderly and self-directed, yet later clarifications hinted at urgency and inevitability. Those two ideas can't comfortably coexist. Either a decision is calm and voluntary, or it is accelerated by circumstances that are no longer controllable. By calmly laying those contradictions side by side, Crockett showed that the narrative wasn't evolving naturally. It was being patched. She emphasized how the official story relied heavily on emotional framing rather than factual grounding. Words like personal, family, and reflection were used repeatedly, yet no concrete explanation followed. Crockett explained that emotional language is often deployed when factual explanations are either inconvenient or incomplete. It creates sympathy while discouraging further questions. The moment she highlighted how often these phrases appear in politically managed exits, the pattern became difficult to ignore. The narrative wasn't meant to inform, it was meant to conclude the conversation quickly. Crockett then focused on how rapidly the talking points aligned across different channels. Statements from leadership, allies, and friendly media echoed the same themes, almost verbatim. That level of coordination rarely happens spontaneously. It suggests preparation, not reaction. She explained that when a story is truly unexpected, responses are messy and inconsistent at first. People disagree on tone, timing, and messaging. In this case, the consistency itself was revealing. It signaled that the narrative had been discussed and agreed upon before the public ever heard it, undermining the claim that the resignation caught anyone by surprise. Another crack in the story appeared when Crockett examined what was left out of the explanation. Entire periods of recent activity were glossed over, as if they didn't exist. Questions about ongoing issues were deflected rather than addressed. She noted that omissions are often more telling than statements because they show where discomfort lies. If there were nothing to hide, those gaps would be easy to fill. Instead, the narrative jumped from cause to conclusion without walking through the middle, creating a logical void that viewers were expected not to notice. She also addressed how defenders framed criticism as partisan noise, an attempt to delegitimize scrutiny rather than engage with it. Crockett explained that labeling questions as political attacks is a common strategy when answers are risky. It shifts focus from substance to motive. Once she pointed this out, the defensive posture itself became part of the evidence that the narrative was under strain. Strong explanations don't require dismissing questions. They withstand them. Crockett then dissected the timeline presented to the public, showing how it conflicted with observable actions. Meetings that supposedly happened after the decision showed signs of urgency that suggested the decision was already looming. Preparations that take weeks appeared to have been completed in days. She didn't accuse anyone of lying outright. She simply asked how those timelines could realistically coexist. The inability to reconcile them without stretching credibility further weakened the official account. She also highlighted the sudden shift in tone from defiance to restraint. Public rhetoric that had once been aggressive softened almost overnight. Crockett explained that such changes usually reflect a recalculation of risk. When someone believes they are secure, they speak freely. When they sense vulnerability, they become careful. That shift didn't align with the idea of a confident, voluntary departure. It aligned with someone navigating constraints that had suddenly tightened. Another moment the narrative faltered was in how responsibility was framed. The explanation emphasized individual choice while distancing institutions from any role in the outcome. Crockett pointed out that institutions rarely remain neutral when their own exposure is at stake. If an exit truly had nothing to do with internal concern, there would be no need to emphasize that distance so strongly. The insistence itself suggested anxiety about association, which contradicted claims of routine transition. She also examined how quickly the story was closed off. Press opportunities were limited, follow-up questions discouraged, and attention redirected elsewhere. Crockett argued that confidence invites transparency, while fragility seeks closure. The speed with which the conversation was wrapped up suggested a desire to prevent deeper examination. That urgency didn't match the calm tone of the official explanation, creating another mismatch between words and behavior. By isolating these inconsistencies, Crockett didn't need to propose an alternative narrative to expose the weakness of the existing one. She'll let the contradictions speak for themselves. Each patch added to the story made it heavier, not stronger, until it could no longer stand without collapsing under its own weight. The more the narrative tried to explain away discomfort, the more it revealed that something fundamental wasn't being said, leaving viewers to recognize that the story they were given was designed less to clarify what happened and more to stop people from asking why. What made Jasmine Crockett's revelation resonate beyond the immediate moment was how it challenged long-held assumptions about how power is exercised and protected inside Congress. She didn't frame the situation as an isolated incident involving one individual. She framed it as a window into a broader system that rarely faces public scrutiny. By doing so, she forced viewers to reconsider the idea that accountability in Congress is driven primarily by ethics or public outrage. Instead, she revealed how accountability often emerges only when power dynamics shift, alliances weaken, and risk calculations change behind the scenes. That reframing alone altered how the resignation was understood. Moving it from personal drama to institutional behavior, Crockett emphasized that power in Congress isn't evenly distributed, nor is accountability. Some figures are shielded for years despite repeated controversies, while others face swift consequences once their usefulness declines. This disparity isn't accidental, it's strategic. She explained that as long as someone delivers value, whether through loyalty, influence, or media attention, tolerance remains high. Once that value diminishes or becomes outweighed by risk, the same behavior that was previously ignored suddenly becomes unacceptable. This realization reframed the resignation as less about wrongdoing suddenly being discovered and more about tolerance suddenly expiring. She also challenged the common belief that public pressure is the primary driver of political consequences. Crockett argued that while public opinion matters, it rarely acts alone. What truly moves outcomes is when public pressure aligns with internal discomfort. When leadership begins to worry not just about optics, but about exposure, precedent, and collateral damage, the response changes dramatically. That alignment appeared to be present here, and once Crockett laid that out, the speed and decisiveness of the resignation made more sense. It wasn't a reaction to one moment, it was a response to converging pressures that could no longer be managed quietly. Another shift Crockett highlighted was how accountability is often framed as moral when it is actually procedural, official. Explanations focus on values and standards, but internal decisions are driven by risk assessments and rule enforcement. When rules are applied selectively, it creates the illusion of moral judgment while concealing strategic calculation. Crockett exposed how that selective enforcement shapes outcomes, making some exits appear principled when they are actually preventative. This distinction matters because it reveals that accountability isn't always about correcting behavior. It's about protecting institutions. She also addressed how narratives of strength and independence are used to mask vulnerability. Resignations are often framed as empowered choices, reinforcing the idea that the individual remained in control until the end. Crockett dismantled that framing by explaining how power rarely relinquishes itself voluntarily. When influence is intact, people fight to keep it. When influence erodes, exits are reframed as choices to preserve dignity. That reframing serves both the individual and the institution, allowing each to avoid deeper questions about what forced the outcome. Crockett further explored how this dynamic affects public trust. When accountability appears inconsistent or opaque, it reinforces cynicism and disengagement. People sense that explanations are incomplete, even if they can't articulate why. By articulating the mechanics behind these decisions, Crockett gave language to that discomfort. She showed that mistrust doesn't arise from ignorance. It arises from patterns that feel familiar even when details are missing. This resignation fit a pattern many have seen before, and her breakdown validated that instinct. She also noted how these moments reinforce power hierarchies within Congress. Those with less leverage face consequences faster and with less protection, while those with stronger networks are given time, cover, and options. Crockett didn't present this as a conspiracy, but as an outcome of incentive structures. Institutions protect themselves first, and individuals are weighed based on how their presence affects that protection. Once that calculus tips, accountability accelerates. Understanding that process changes how people interpret future resignations and scandals, making it harder to accept surface explanations without scrutiny. Another important shift Crockett created was in how responsibility is perceived. By focusing on systems rather than personalities, she redirected attention from individual blame to institutional design. That doesn't absolve individuals of responsibility, but it broadens the question from who did what to why the system responded the way it did. This perspective challenges audiences to think beyond outrage and ask deeper questions about reform, transparency, and consistency. It suggests that removing one person doesn't necessarily address the conditions that allowed a situation to develop in the first place. She also highlighted how moments like this are used to signal boundaries internally. When someone is pushed out, it sends a message to others about what is tolerated and what is not, but that message is often selective and situational. Crockett explained that these signals are meant more for insiders than for the public. The resignation wasn't just an ending, it was a warning and a recalibration. Understanding that function reveals how power maintains order without public confrontation. By tying all of this together, Crockett shifted the conversation from shock to structure. The resignation stopped being a surprising headline and became a case study in how accountability actually works when power is at stake. Her explanation didn't offer comfort or closure, it offered clarity. It asked viewers to look past official statements and consider the incentives, pressures, and calculations that shape political outcomes. Once those dynamics are seen clearly, it becomes impossible to view this resignation, or others like it, as simple acts of conscience or coincidence, because they reflect a system responding to threat, preserving itself, and reminding everyone inside it where the real limits of power and protection lie.